national broadband leaders up here for our next panel. I'm going to quickly go through the introductions and let Jim kind of kick off in just a second. Jim Baller is going to moderate our panel session up here where we have Joanne Hovis, Joe Starks, and Patrick Hawley from the FCC. They're going to be talking about policy issues, policy affecting broadband deployment. I can tell you a little bit about Jim Baller before we start. Jim is president of the Baller Herbst Law Group, national law firm based in Washington, D.C. and Minneapolis, Minnesota. The only law firm in the United States to be named to Broadband Community Magazine's Fiber to the Home Top 100. Baller Herbst represents clients in a broad range of communication matters nationally and in more than 35 states, including telecommunications, cable television, high-capacity broadband communications, the internet, wireless communications, right-of-way management, pole and conduit attachments, and barriers to community broadband initiatives. Jim was also the founder and president of the U.S. Broadband Coalition, a large and diverse consortium of prominent communications providers, high-technology companies, manufacturers, labor unions, public interest, and consumer groups.
That's all.
Jim's going to moderate a bunch of different, he's telling me to cut off all those accolades, and okay, we'll cut it off now. It's putting into your debate time. Jim promised me he was going to solve the whole issue of net neutrality in the next 35 minutes, so we're going to hear how he's going to do that in just a minute. Jim, it's all yours. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So all of that boils down to my being, in my own view, the most fortunate attorney in the country to be able to do the kinds of things that we do on a day-by-day basis, working with people of the kind that are on this panel with me. Joanne Hovis to my right and Joe Starks to my far left are two of the very, very best consultants in the United States who have not just great in-depth knowledge, but have Thank you, Joe.
He's keeping it.
Joanne?
I know he is.
But have done it, have put together successful projects across the country. And Patrick Hawley, next to me here, the Associate Chief of the Wireline Competition Bureau at the FCC, is the person who you would want to ask about such things as where the Commission stands on a great many issues that are important to us. Our format is going to be no presentations, but just responding to questions. I have studiously not told our panelists what questions I'm going to ask them, so you'll get very impromptu answers, but I'm sure you'll find them right on the money. What we're going to do is to focus on the role of government at all levels, federal, state, and local, and what government can do from a policy standpoint, from a regulatory standpoint, from a facilitation standpoint, or from a hands-on standpoint to accelerate the deployment, adoption, and use of broadband, particularly at the high-capacity levels that we all regard to be as important as they are. We're going to focus on three areas: legal and regulatory barriers, access to infrastructure and other construction-related barriers, and economic barriers in the operation and successful development and marketing of projects. And I'm going to start by asking Joe to address legal barriers from the standpoint of someone who has worked on several successful projects in New York and who is also working in North Carolina, which has a much less friendly state regulatory framework. And Joe, what's the difference? How does it feel from an operational standpoint?
That's a good question. There's no press here, is there? No. What we found in New York is an extremely friendly environment by which to create a municipal broadband opportunity and public-private partnerships. For the most part, we found that the Public Service Commission has been extremely supportive, and that we find the role that the government has essentially played in New York has been more of a mediator to help us get stuff done and not a hindrance. Conversely, North Carolina has chosen to pass a bill called HB 129, which prohibits municipalities from getting into the broadband business. And we're seeing some of the issues with that now, in particular in the rural areas where they can't get funding and they can't get investment because the density of population isn't there. And we're finding that the communities that really want to initiate these projects, their hands are tied. So the main difference for me, Jim, is that New York has adopted an approach with the government to be more of a facilitator versus North Carolina, which has really been more of a hindrance.
Thank you.
Can I add to that?
You're next. In
Same
fact.
question or a different question?
Well, a related question.
All right.
The commission has, or in particular, the chairman has spoken recently several times about the commission's concern about these barriers. Would you share with our audience what the current thinking behind those statements may be?
Sure, and I think he actually said it in front of the House Energy and Commerce Committee a couple weeks ago too. And the bottom line is, we often kind of joke that the mantra of the chairman is competition, competition, competition. He's always talking about competition. And I think bottom line is his perspective is that competition, where the market, where market forces enable carriers to come in and compete because there's a business case for them to do so, that's fantastic. And in large part, that's occurring across the country. At the same time, there's no real justification, as far as he can see, for limiting competition of all kinds. And if that includes competition that results in, if that includes enabling community-driven projects to be part of that competition equation, it doesn't make any sense to him to withhold that element of the competitive equation. So one of the things we're looking at, I don't want to talk about the open internet, to be honest with you. We can, but one of the things that came out of that decision that was interesting that he has cited several times was even with the dissenting judge talked about the Section 706 of the Communications Act, in which the FCC, which the one thing that came out of the DC Circuit case was clear is that we do have jurisdiction over the open internet. It's just a matter of how we exercise it. And one element of that is Section 706 of the Act, and even the dissenting judge kind of pointed out, one thing that's clear is if Section 7706 of the Communications Act says that the FCC has to take steps to remove barriers to broadband investment, that seems pretty clear to him, again, this is the dissenter, that state and local laws that prohibit a local community from deploying a network is a barrier to investment. So I think the chairman has looked at that and said, well, let's take a look. What does Section 706 enable us to do to promote competition?
Joanne, you are the CEO of the Coalition for Local Internet Choice. Would you tell our audience what that is and what your goals are?
Sure. So Jim just gave me about 30 seconds of notice on the fact that we're going public with the Coalition for Local Internet Choice. You are all the first people to hear about it. The Coalition for Local Internet Choice, or CLIC, is an entity that we co-founded over the past few months with the goal of building and expanding the substantial existing coalition of public and private entities that are advocating for local internet choice. Very much in keeping with the way that Patrick just described the chairman's perspective on this issue, the idea here is that, in the words of an insightful person in North Carolina, we are stabbing ourselves with our own knives if we put in place policies that stop our local communities from working on broadband availability, broadband deployment, and broadband expansion, including competition. And the idea is to support the principle that because the internet is so fundamental to the workings of our economy and our democracy, and those things, the economic activity and democratic activity, happen at a local level, there is a strong local interest in having involvement in broadband. And that might mean building and operating a broadband network by a public entity at the local level, or it might mean working with private providers on public-private partnerships. But many of the laws in the 20 states around the country that have these laws, many of those laws stop even public-private partnerships from emerging. They are purely about stopping the emergence of competition. And at the end of the day, that should not be the decision of a company that is located many states away. It should be the decision of a local community through its elected officials locally. That's the idea behind this coalition. So I guess we just went public, and I hope anybody who is interested will approach one of us after today's meeting. Our board of advisors includes Vint Cerf of Google and Sharon Gillette of Microsoft, and representation of a wide range of public and private entities, because on the whole, I think many of the entities engaged in this sector of our economy understand that when it comes to an infrastructure of critical national and local importance, we simply can't afford to say an entire category is off limits for involvement in deployment.
Wonderful. So I'm going to take the moderator's discretion to take 2 minutes for questions before we move on to the next topic. Does anyone have any questions for any of our panelists on legal and regulatory barriers? Yes, sir.
Well, even though one of your panelists really doesn't want to talk about it, I think we should talk about it, and that is, and I want to rephrase it in a way maybe that would be helpful to your commenting in the most transparent and candid way. What about net neutrality serves as a hindrance to the expansion of broadband access?
What about net neutrality?
Right.
The absence of net neutrality or rules?
Having. I'm sort of, I think I'm trying to help you in answering with as much dimension as possible all the issues related to net neutrality.
Could I restate your question, please, and direct it at Joe, because I was going to ask a question that you happened to anticipate my transitional question. Joe, you have developed several open access networks in the state of New York. Have you found open access, as you define it, to be a hindrance to the development of those networks? And also, please talk about how those essentially middle mile networks are taking the next step to fiber to the home. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's a good start.
All right.
About 15 years ago, no. Actually, Jim, the open access models we've been developing here in New York State, probably about 15 years, roughly 15 years ago. The first true open access model was DANK, and I think I saw David here, and I keep calling his name out, giving him credit somewhere, but we developed that model, and that model has grown over time. Have all of the models, open access models, grown over time to include such things as competition. Each one of those open access models is bringing carriers in from outside of New York. We're seeing investment by the private sector that's 3 or 4 times the investment that was made in the open access model itself on the part of the government. So the creation of the open access model has led to a number of things, primarily investment by the private sector, competition, but what it's done is it's become a foundation to launch other opportunities. Here today, we've talked about Southern Tier Network, Access Ontario, DANK, and others. Well, if it weren't for the DANK network getting off the ground 15 years ago, that served as the foundation to help launch the fiber to the home builds that we're seeing in the North Country, right? That's a collaborative and a partnership that launched that. Similarly, Ontario County, which was 7 or 8 years ago, launched an open access model. Now, on top of being one of the very first communities in the U.S. to get 4G broadband ahead of most of the major NFL cities, they're also now launching fiber to the home projects. The Southern Tier Network, which is the newest model, announced operations, start of operations, completion of construction last year, essentially at the end of 2013. And they're already enticing fiber to the home builds and also gigabit to the home builds. So we're seeing that these foundations that were created 15 years ago up to now are really launching a lot of other opportunities, up to and including bringing jobs in from outside of the area and companies that are investing.
Patrick, did you want
Honestly, not that I don't want to talk about open internet, it's that it's not an issue that I work on a regular basis that I would feel comfortable sort of speaking on behalf of the chairman.
Okay. Let's switch to access to infrastructure, poles, ducts, conduits, towers, rights of way. Joanne, you have written a paper sponsored by Google on what local governments can do to make it possible for entrants like Google and others to do so more quickly and cost effectively, and therefore to accelerate development of fiber networks. Could you give us some of the highlights of that report and where anyone interested in it can find it?
Thanks, Jim. For those of you who heard 45 minutes from me on this morning, I apologize if this is repetitive. But essentially what we did from an engineering standpoint, which is what most of my company does, is engineering of networks. We looked at what are the factors that can, both for public and private deployment of fiber networks in particular, what are the factors that can actually make a difference over time and what your costs are for deploying that network, whether you're a public or a private entity. The idea being that if you're public, you are bringing down your costs through these kinds of strategies. If you're trying to attract a private provider, bringing down some of their costs may be what differentiates you from another community. And in very quick summary, there are a range of different things you can do. They fall, in our opinion, into three big categories. The first is building and managing and maintaining key assets like fiber optics, conduit, poles if you have them, and certain kinds of real estate and facilities where networks can interconnect with each other, essentially meet-me points. The second would be access to information, standardizing your information, managing it, and bringing it to the highest quality possible, and then within the parameters of what is acceptable from a public safety standpoint, potentially sharing that information with deployers makes it far quicker for them to come into a community, understand what you have, and start working. So you have GIS data and that sort of thing that, so long as there's no public safety consideration, could be made available to a private company like Google or a local company and make it easier for them to build in your community. And then the third is just maximizing and optimizing processes of your community within the constraints of resources. So there are a lot of companies that would like you to totally change your permitting process, or streamline it, maybe add additional staffing around permitting and inspections and so on, because it makes their construction quicker and more efficient. Within the constraints of resources, and depending on whether this makes sense for a community, that may be worth doing. Should be the community's call, in my opinion, but these are strategies that you can use if it's of interest. And they're about 160 pages with a lot of engineering detail and drawings. If you're really interested in seeing it, it's on my website at ctcnet.us, and the title is Gigabit Communities.
Joe, in the course of your building out several networks, what have been the significant infrastructure challenges that you've run into, and how did you address them successfully?
I think early on our significant challenges were getting the incumbents and the locals to understand that we weren't trying to compete and put them out of business, but rather to work with them. Getting the energy and the telecom utility pole owners and conduit owners on board. And we learned a hard lesson with that, because if they're not on board and they didn't participate, nothing moved very fast. So what we've learned, quite frankly, is to get them on board early, right? Sit down with your project, engage everybody that you need to have at the table, but bring those pathway owners to the table as quickly as possible and get that out of the way. Make it as easy as you can on yourselves to deploy.
Patrick, not that I necessarily agree with what the FCC has done, but I think that in fairness, could you tell the audience how the FCC has tried to improve access to infrastructure?
Sure. So Mr. Adelstein this morning talked a little bit about on the wireless side. We're doing a lot on the wireless infrastructure side to try to accelerate, streamline, simplify the process as much as we can to enable, siting of smaller cell technology. So, working with industry, there's a local government component to that as well. but trying to make the process to get that kind of infrastructure in place streamlined and as easy as it can be. We also have what we call the Broadband Acceleration Initiative, which was started under Chairman Janikowski, where we're taking steps. We addressed polls in an order when actually Sharon Gillette was my boss in the Wireline Bureau. Poll issues, but one of the things I would say related to the question you just asked was, I think the commission is paying attention. I know the commission is paying attention to the checklist that you talked about, to the efforts that Google and C Spire Mississippi and others are doing, where it's a very community-led process, as compared to the FCC, which is more of a top-down, provide funding to carriers model, at least historically. And while these checklists and the things that you were just describing, they're very much a local and state-level issue. One of the things that I can say from the chairman in particular wants to know is, outside of legal barrier type issues where we may be able to take some sort of action, if there are specific things that the FCC can do at a national level through policy to help make these types of deployments happen, we're all ears. And so to the extent that there are specific recommendations, I'd love to hear them. Sounds like there might be.
Can I offer one? Were you about to ask me a question? I was going to take a cut at Patrick's.
I figured you might. Go ahead.
So I think there are a wide range of things that become challenges during deployment. In my experience, one of the biggest challenges for much of the community here, at least in the states where I have worked, is frequently pole access. And even in states where we have no barriers or limited barriers to municipal and county involvement in broadband, getting onto poles can sometimes be very challenging because the entities that frequently own the poles are the entities who would like to ideally make sure that there's not a lot of competition riding on those poles, despite the fact that one would pay for that access. And I see that challenge all the time. Under federal law, localities or public sector entities that are not regulated entities do not have pole attachment rights. And as a practical matter, I think there are so many things that are thrown up as barriers. So I was actually dealing this morning with a situation on a county build where the county is just trying to get some fiber out to some of its Head Start centers. And the pricing that came back on Make Ready from the ILEC was 3 times what it's been in the past. And they said, well, we've imposed a new engineering fee. This new pricing makes absolutely inconceivable that that fiber will ever be built. We pulled back the project immediately. Can't even pay the permitting fees given that. And Patrick, I hope that's something that you guys are at least thinking about, is whether some of these pole access issues are of note.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, I apologize to all of you. We can't even begin to talk intelligently about these issues in the brief amount of time that we have. And so I'll come back to you, but let me make sure that we get to a couple of things that are important. Patrick, moving to incentives and opportunities to reduce costs of operating, very important to many of the projects are E-rate subsidies, E-rate. The E-rate program is currently under review. Part of the work that you're doing with the Connect America Fund involves experimental, or the possibility of experiments for creative forms of funding for rural broadband. Could you address both of those topics? The E-rate reform, where that may be taking us, as well as where we are with Connect America Fund reform.
Excuse me. Wow, in a 30-second answer, let's see.
There you go.
Those are big topics, both of those. So big picture with E-rate, today we spend about half of the money within the E-rate program on traditional telephone service. It's a $2.4 billion program. I think the general thinking that's gaining traction is we need to modernize this program. We need to make it a broadband program. So I think over time you're going to start to see a much greater emphasis, and when I say over time, I mean in the near future, You're going to see a much greater emphasis on connectivity to the school and library, so wide area networks, the internet access that schools and libraries have to pay to try to get the speeds at which these schools and libraries are connected at are 100 megabits today up to a gigabit in the near future. So much greater focus on fiber or high capacity broadband connections to the school as we transition support over time away from what I would consider legacy technologies. I also think a big piece of that is going to be connectivity inside the classroom. The record is pretty clear that simply having a really big fat pipe to the school and that's it is not enough. And so you're going to see a much greater focus in the near future within the E-rate program of allocating a lot more funding towards internal connections and Wi-Fi within the classroom and the libraries. That certainly seems to be the direction that schools are going as they move towards digital learning models. So big picture, it's high capacity broadband to the school and the library, Wi-Fi within the school and the library, sort of transitioning away from legacy technologies to more high capacity broadband, which we think is the future of digital learning, and certainly that's what the record says. There's a whole lot of details there underneath that statement. But on the Connect America Fund side, this is our high-cost universal service fund. It's a $4.5 billion budget that we spend on an annual basis. About $2 billion goes to the smaller rate of return carriers. About $2 billion roughly goes to the larger price cap carriers. This is where I think you're going to see some innovation over the next year, and that is, historically we have provided support to eligible telecommunications carriers, ETCs. We will continue to provide support to ETCs. But one of the things that is interesting is we're about to make an offer of support to the incumbent carriers, the price cap carriers. Verizon, Frontier, Century, Windstream, Fairpoint, AT&T. And based on a model, we're going to make an offer to them that says, here's what our model says. This is how much it says that an efficient provider should need to run a broadband network. Here's how much money we offer you, the carrier, the incumbent, to deploy broadband to these, what we consider high-cost areas. If it's a low-cost area, we're not going to provide support. But for these high-cost areas, here are the locations that should be served. Here's the amount of money our model suggests you need to offer that support. The incumbent's going to have a choice. Take the money, meet their service obligations over a 5-year period. I mentioned earlier that there's a question about what those obligations may be, whether we should do more than 4 megabits for that money, whether we should increase it to 10 or something like that. That's one of the few open issues that remain. What will be interesting, though, is if they say no. We've never really had competition within the Universal Service Program. And we're setting ourselves up now where if an incumbent carrier, and it's a statewide offer of support, and if the incumbent carrier in a given state, take New York, the incumbent price cap carrier says, you know what, that's not enough for me, I don't think so. Or maybe it is enough, but I'd rather just be a 4G wireless company instead of a rural telephone company. And that's their prerogative. No one's knocking that. Businesses make decisions. But if that is to happen, the question is, who's going to step up and build broadband then for those unserved areas? And we will, for the first time, run a competitive process for that subsidy, i.e., who can come in on a census tract level, for example, and who's going to say, I will build broadband at the lowest possible subsidy amount, whether that's an electric co-op, the incumbent. We're not going to exclude them from that competitive process. They may want to only participate in certain areas. A wireless provider, if they can meet the minimum requirements, a cable company, small rural rate of return telco that wants to edge out. So it'll be the first time we've really run for this type of program a competitive process for the subsidy, which will be interesting. And that'll sort of start to happen, I would say, fourth quarter this year.
Talk about the experimental
Sure.
program and the possibility of participating in that once you've finished your
Right.
analyses.
So everything I just said sounds great, but we've never done it before. So we've done it to a limited extent for wireless support through what we call our mobility fund, where we did. But those are companies that are used to participating in auctions, even if it was a different kind of reverse auction, where we awarded $350 million in support via a reverse auction to wireless carriers to build out in areas that don't have 3G or 4G. But that was sort of a limited, one industry-specific kind of a situation. So we realize we've never done that. We think we know what we're doing. We think it'll be successful. At the same time, we've never done it. So that's why earlier this year in January, part of an IP transitions order, we essentially said we're interested in learning about who might be interested in stepping up in a competitive process like that where an incumbent doesn't take our offer. And so we invited expressions of interest from any type of carrier who might want to be part of that process. We got 1,000. I think a couple of the commissioners were saying, well, the commission should have to approve each one of these. Maybe they changed their mind after we got 1,000. Maybe they'll let the Bureau decide that now. So we got, I think, more than we expected from electric co-ops, wireless ISPs, cable companies, rate of return small carriers, lots of different entities expressing an interest in building out. A lot of it was fiber to the home. A lot of it was really high capacity networks. And so we will soon, can't say exactly when, but I think soon is a safe bet, go to order where we say, here's the budget that we're going to make available for these types of experiments. Here are the criteria for participation. Here's how we will essentially review and assess applications that are filed. And it'll be open to anybody who's willing to come in and wants to participate in the process.
Including any of you who did not file a letter of expressing interest the first time around.
Absolutely. Those expressions for those who did were fantastic because they really gave us some insight into the types of networks, the types of places that people might be interested in building. But if you didn't, that's fine. We learned a lot from it. Now we'll go to order and formally invite proposals, which ought to happen in the near future, I hope.
Okay. Joe, last word. Could you take just a minute or two to put in a plug for the New York State Toolkit?
Oh, absolutely.
That's for those who didn't see your presentation earlier in detail.
Absolutely. I would like to say, we've worked around the country quite a bit, and this has always been something that every state, every community has struggled with, is how do you organize yourselves to be able to pull together a municipal type broadband project. In New York State, David and his team have done a great job of creating that foundation. And for those of you that went to the session this morning, you got the book. It's a work in progress. It's not cast in stone, but it's a great starting point. And there's a lot of communities, there's a lot of organizations that will, in states for that fact, that will charge forward without that level of organization. So as that document continues to develop, I think it's going to increase our chances in New York to nail down those grant dollars because, quite frankly, we need them. And we see that those grant dollars are going to communities and entities that are well prepared. So I think that document is the first step in helping you to prepare for moving your initiative forward. Because as I said earlier, the end result of all this is going to come a business plan. If you're going to get money from the private sector or the public sector, you're going to need a business plan that's going to show the need and what you're going to do with the money. And that document is an excellent first step at being able to do that. It's the only one we've seen in the country so far at the state level.
Dave, 3 minutes for questions. Okay. Did you still have questions? Please.
Yes, one of the problems that I had, I'm Kitty Vetter, I'm in Sullivan County, and I don't know if you know Sullivan County, but it's a very, very rural area. And a number of you spoke about competition. But the competitor has to go to his shareholder and say, okay, this is going to be a worthwhile project, which is the reason why many places never come
Joanne, why don't you start, not necessarily Universal Service Fund, but steps that you have seen work in rural counties, rural areas?
So there are a lot of potential tools at your disposal. And I do want to come to the universal service thing or leave it to Patrick, because I
Okay.
think what he was talking about relates exactly to what you were talking about. What you just described is a very common story in rural areas. It's more common than I wish it were. It's really a challenge. And in some rural areas where there's an independent telephone company that's been well funded through the Universal Service Fund, sometimes there's really outstanding infrastructure. And then in a community right down the road, there might be almost nothing that's sufficient for economic development. Some of the strategies at your disposal would include things like trying to understand where is money being spent in your community right now? What is county government spending? What are the municipalities, if you have any spending in your county? What are the schools spending, libraries, public safety, other kinds of big customers? And looking at all of that spending and all of that demand and trying to understand how can that, if it's aggregated and if it's working together, is that enough money to use as leverage to get you something new? And in most places, that is actually the case if all of those different entities are able to work together. It's not going to happen if there's not a certain amount of coordination. But if you put all of that telecommunications service purchasing power together, chances are that public sector group of entities is the biggest buyer in your community. And then you have some strategies that you can use to try to take that buying power and build infrastructure to connect your major government buildings, your schools, libraries, and the other entities that I just described. I know it sounds like an enormous effort and very difficult, but it's actually, when you look at how much you're spending currently, the business model does tend to work. There are viable ways to build infrastructure to meet the needs of those entities and to do it in a cost-effective way where you're taking the money that you would have spent on services and using it to build yourself something, owning instead of renting, as it were. There are also strategies you can use to try to make the community attractive to private providers. But in rural areas, that's very challenging. I don't mean to suggest this is easy. It's very hard because most of the larger companies are going to go where the return is greatest. And no matter what we do at the local level, in some communities, they're just not going to be interested because they can make money elsewhere, or they can make more money elsewhere. And I'll let Patrick talk about the rural broadband experiment, but that is a program, it's not called a grant, but it's the equivalent of a grant. The FCC is talking about giving money to entities, potentially including counties, or other kinds of entities, your nonprofits, who might be interested in this sort of thing, that would help to build some infrastructure. You'd have to do a lot of work and you'll have to make some showings of sustainability and other things, but the FCC is very engaged in trying to solve exactly the problem you just described.
Can I ask you who the local incumbent provider is where you are? Verizon?
That's the only one. Frontier very small.
All right, so our rules historically, so we updated our rules to the Universal Service Program in 2011. And it's very clear that we're moving forward with this Connect America Fund. It'll really start happening later this year. And what I just described earlier will take place. Now, if you're in a rural, very high-cost area, what's going to happen is Verizon's going to have a choice. And so they'll either, if there are high-cost locations, which I suspect there are in Sullivan County, our model will say, here's how much support you get. And they will have a decision to make as to whether or not they want to deploy statewide or not. And if they do, then great. They're going to have obligations. They're going to have to build out in the rural areas. If they don't, then you're going to have an open competitive process like I talked about. And the way we're looking at that competitive process is it could be Verizon, or it could be a cable company that wants to edge out, or it could be whoever's willing to serve that area. And we are, as Joanne said, I think our objective is to make it open to any entity that wants to step up, which could include a local municipally run entity, with one caveat. The universal service is a statutorily mandated requirement of the FCC. I mean, the bottom line is we have to take steps to ensure that rural consumers have access to the reasonably comparable services at reasonably comparable rates. How do we do that? We provide subsidies to companies so that they can build a network and charge a rate that otherwise they wouldn't be able to charge because there's just not enough people, right? And so To get federal universal service dollars, though, for that infrastructure, you have to be called what's called an eligible telecommunications carrier, an ETC. It's a specific function. A carrier is an ETC. The state of New York designates ETCs. The PUC does it. And so there are requirements to be an ETC. You have to hold yourself out. You have to offer service. You have to meet whatever requirements the state says an ETC has to meet. So we do provide funding. We are willing, in the case where the incumbent turns down our funding, to provide opportunities for anyone who wants to step up, I think is our objective. But there is that requirement that whoever is going to do it meets those ETC requirements. Yeah.
So we submitted an expression of interest letter as a county because of, it's been years now that we're still piecemealing and patchworking and cobbled together. So, given everything that you've said with regards to, Universal Service Fund and New York being a donor state to the Universal Service Fund, and by that I mean that we give more than we get back. So would you ever, because, and I had spoken to Joanne earlier about this, that we have the makings of a 10-tower public safety interoperability project. Would that be considered a match if we were using state funding through the Department of Homeland Security as part of an incentive for these ILECs or whoever, WISPs, whoever ends up coming, because that's an additional subsidy if they're using towers or something? Is that a model that's been used?
Not in the universal service context.
So that, what you're telling me is that it's only going to go to commercial providers?
No, not what I'm saying. I'm just saying historically it's gone to ETCs, eligible telecommunications carriers, who are almost by and large always an incumbent telephone company, big or small.
Patrick, correct me if I'm wrong, but there is an opportunity here in terms of, we don't have the rules from the FCC yet.
No.
That's coming soon, as Patrick said. But generally, what we've been led to understand is that a wide range of different entities could apply for the funds, and if you get the award, you would have to become or partner with an ETC.
That's correct.
There are certain regulatory hoops you will have to jump through.
That's right.
But it does not preclude any entity from getting engaged now and looking at its opportunities, which is part of evaluating whether you want to do it, is looking at the obligations of an ETC and deciding whether you want to live with that or whether there's a partner out there who is an ETC that you can work with. But all of this is feasible. And the ideas around matches and so on that happen very frequently in a grant environment, this is a different kind of
Yeah.
program. You don't have to think in those terms.
So please join me in thanking our panelists. And I wish we had more time, but if you have additional questions, I'm sure our panelists will be happy to answer them individually, either here or subsequently.
Wish
All
you had
right,
more
thank
time
you.
too, Jim. That was a great panel discussion. You almost solved the net neutrality pieces in there. A little much further than I think we would have got there. Thanks so much.